Hi guys, this is a video on indifference curve essays. I think indifference curve is a very important topic to prepare for. So the consumer theory, utility theory and indifference curve for me is one topic that everyone should prepare for the exam that's coming. And I'm going to show you all the recent questions that have come on this and hope that you guys prepare it really well for your exam, which is happening I think on the 21st or 22nd. So good luck with that, and let's start with our indifference curve essays. So in May, June 2018, the first question that came, which was on indifference curve, it says that explain with the aid of diagram diminishing marginal utility and its link with indifference curve. So that's a good question to prepare for. Basically, we need to explain key terms of diminishing marginal utility and then also talk about how it's linked with indifference curve. So let's talk about that. So first of all, we start with that concept of utility. And in the concept of utility, we talk about the whole idea about how as we consume goods, we get satisfaction, or utility. And when you look at utility, a consumer has basically, we need to look at two concepts here, the total utility and the marginal utility. So when you look at total utility is the total satisfaction from a given amount of goods, like 5 cups of tea, while marginal utility is the extra utility from the consumption of one additional unit. So from one additional unit. So first thing first, I'm going to explain the idea that a consumer, when he gets goods, he gets satisfaction or utility. Then I talk about total utility, which is the total satisfaction that we get from consumer good, and then marginal utility. And then I explain the concept that as we consume more and more, so this is my quantity of a good, and let's say this is my TU. As I consume more and more of the good, total utility rises, but it rises, TU rises but slowly, which means that the slope of TU, which is equal to change in TU over change in quantity, which in turn is equal to your marginal utility, that marginal utility or slope is going down as we consume more and more of the good. So my marginal utility is falling like this because of what we say. This is where we talk about the law of diminishing marginal utility, which says this, that as quantity rises, mu falls. So the first idea that we need to establish is the law of diminishing marginal utility. So that's the first sort of paragraph that I'm going to talk about, is this, that as we consume more of a good, we get satisfaction. Satisfaction basically is utility. Utility can be divided into TU and MU, and then talk about how there is a law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, in order for us to link this concept with the indifference curve, what I need to talk about is basically the idea that what's the goal of a consumer? The goal of a consumer is to maximize TU from a given budget. So if I have a given budget, I want to make sure that I maximize my total utility from a given budget, and that is done through what we call our Equi marginal principle, which basically says this, that the mu of x, let's say good x, over price of good x must be equal to any mu of y, good y, over price of y is equal to any mu n over price of n. And if this ratio, equi-marginal principle, is not true, then the consumer will allocate his resources in a manner that it becomes equal. So I can give an example. I say, for example, if MUX over price of X is greater than MUY over price of Y. This means that the marginal utility, change the color as well, marginal utility per dollar spent is greater for good X than good Y. What do we do then? We buy more of X, we buy less of Y. But when you buy more of X, according to the equimarginal principle, mu of X will start to fall. Buy less of Y, mu of Y would start to rise. And then there will come a point when this side will start to fall, this side will start to rise. But we keep on substituting till MUX over price of X become equal to MUY over price of Y. And at that point, when this becomes equal, we no longer want to substitute any further, because we have achieved what we call the maximum satisfaction from a given budget. So that's what we need to write in words. Now, how do we link that to our indifference curve? So what is the indifference curve? Basically, this is because what the question is asking us. According to the indifference curve basically tells us the satisfaction that we can achieve from two goods. So this is my good Y, let's say, this is my good X. So by definition, indifference curve tells us the various sort of combination that it gives us equal satisfaction. So all these combinations, be it combination A or be it combination B or be it combination C, gives us equal satisfaction. Now with this, we attach ourselves, or we introduce the concept of the budget line. What is the budget line? Well, budget line, when indifference curve tells us our preferences. So let me write this. Indifference curve tells us our preferences. Our budget line tells us what we call our affordability. So this is my budget line. It tells us our affordability. So this is your quantity of good X over quantity of good Y. Now you will say this, that the slope of the indifference curve is simply MUX over MU of Y, and you don't need to sort of prove it. And the slope of the budget line is PX over PY. And you will say this, that budget line tells us the various combination of two goods a consumer can afford from a given limited income, while indifference curve tells us the various combinations that gives an equal satisfaction. And a consumer whose goal is to maximize total utility from a given budget, he can do that when indifference curve, let me write this, we can maximize TU from a given budget when when indifference curve is parallel to the budget line. So I'm going to make that line, I'm going to make that diagram and show that. And by the way, this budget line is should be straight line. I just used my pencil, should have used a ruler to make a straight line. So I'm going to make that properly now. So if this is my axis, right, I don't know why they're coming. So this is good X, this is good Y, and this is my sort of budget line. So all the indifference curve, let's say I0 or I1 or I2, are those indifference curves that are affordable for this individual. So all the indifference curve except for I2 are affordable. So for example, if I look at indifference curve I2 versus I0 versus I1, I2 will always be preferred over I1, which will always be preferred over I0, because I2 gives us more satisfaction. So that's one thing you will talk about, that when it comes to indifference curve, all indifference curve gives you different satisfaction. The one on the right gives you the most satisfaction. Now, when you look at affordability in I0 and I1, both are affordable. So you can say this, that all these points A, B, C are affordable. But when you look at C is the one, or when you look at I1, so I1 is the one that gives us the maximum possible satisfaction from a given income. So because indifference curve I1 is better than I0, we will always prefer I1 over I0 because more is better. And also because I1 is affordable, it is on our budget line, means you will prefer to point C. So point C is better than point A and B, which means that if point C is preferred over A and B, this means that C is the point where the consumer is maximizing his utility from a given budget. And the way I'm going to talk about this is that at point C, the budget line is tangent to the indifference curve. And that means basically it's parallel or tangent to the indifference curve, which means that point is where MUX over MU of Y, which is the budget lines, which is the indifference curve slope, should be equal to PX over PY, which means, in other words, MUX over PX is equal to MUY over PY, which is where our equi-marginal principle is also true. So this is the link between indifference curve and your utility concept, that the point where indifference curve is tangent to the to the budget line is the point where the consumer is maximizing his total utility from a given budget. So this seems to be like a lot of writing, but in reality it won't be, because you're explaining the concepts. You need to first talk about the indifference curve. So that's your first paragraph. Let me go back to that first paragraph. You need to talk about the first paragraph, which is the indifference curve, which is the utility concept. Then we talk about the equi-marginal principle. Then we talk about how indifference curve has a slope which is MUX over MUY, how budget line has a slope where which is PX over PY, and how a consumer goal is met when the indifference curve is tangent to the budget line. So that's first part for the question. Now I'm going to move on to the second part of the question, which says this, that discuss using indifference curve analysis how the impact of an increase in indirect taxation on the quantity demanded of a good depends on whether the good is normal or inferior. So first thing first is that what is an indirect tax? It's a tax on expenditure. So it's a tax on expenditure. What does it do? Well, it results in the price of a good to go up and the quantity to fall as cost of production goes up, although artificially, and that results basically, for us, what is important to understand is the price of the good is going up. So let's look at indifference curve analysis, because indirect taxation has an effect of increasing the price on the good. So whenever the price of a good goes up, so that's where the income and substitution effect plays, and they are talking about normal and inferior goods. So understand this, that once you explain the effect of indirect taxes, which is simply that indirect taxes result in the price of a good to go up and the quantity to fall. Now we define what we call a normal good. A normal good is the one is a good where the income go up, you will see the demand of that good to fall. Demand of that good to increase, while inferior good is a good where when your income go up, your demand for the good will fall. Now, when we look at price effect we say is made up of substitution effect plus income effect. Substitution effect says this: when the price of a good goes down, you will always buy more of that good. And vice versa, when the price of a good goes up, you will buy less of that good. And for both normal and inferior goods, we will say this: for both normal goods and inferior goods, the relationship will be when the price goes up, the quantity demanded will go down because there is what we call the substitute will become relatively cheaper. So let me write this. This is because the substitute will become relatively cheaper. So that's the first thing we talk about, that both goods have the same income and substitution effect. Both goods have the same substitution effect, irrespective of the nature of the good. Substitution effect always says this, that price goes up, you buy less of the good. So when the price goes up, we buy less of the good. That's because of my substitution effect. Income effect, on the other hand, says this, that when the price goes up, your real income goes down. And when the real income goes down, if the good is normal, you will basically buy less of that good because your real income is going down, your purchasing power is going down. But if the good is inferior and the price goes up, your real income goes down, and if the good is inferior, you should buy more of that good. That's where the distinction between normal and inferior will come, because the income effect says, in the case of normal goods, buy less, but in the case of inferior goods, it will say buy more. And then you talk about the idea that, however, for normal goods, therefore, normal goods, both SE and IE, say substitution effect and income effect, reinforce each other. They reinforce each other, they move in the same direction, and they both will say when the price goes up, you should buy less of that good because your substitutes are becoming relatively cheaper and your real income is also basically going down. But for inferior goods, on the other hand, we say this, that SE and IE move in the opposite direction, and what we say is this, that SE says buy less, IE says buy more. But, and that's an important point to talk about, is that but since the good is inferior, SE, substitution effect, will be still greater than IE, because if the good is inferior, it's so low in price that income effect won't be too large, and that in turn means that we will still buy more of that good, because the SE, and that's what we need to write, SE will outweigh IE, and that's an important distinction to write here. So that's where I'm going to now make the diagrams for both the goods, but you need to talk about this. So this is what we need to write, and then the diagrams will come, and that's your answer for the good. But we need to go back to the question, because the question is saying discuss using indifference curve how the impact of an increase in indirect tax on the quantity demanded depends on whether the good is normal or inferior. But if I go back to the diagram now, I'm going to make the diagram for both the normal. So let's first make the diagram for a normal good, and here we're showing that the price is going up and not going down, which is something which we need to practice as well. A lot of us only practice when the price is going down, but you need to also practice when the price is going up. So let's draw the diagram for the price going up. So this is good Y, then we make good X. Let's make a very flat line, and I tell you why, because it's always easy to show income substitution effect if you make a flat line rather than a very steep line. So let's say initially your budget line is this blue line. When the price of good X goes down, now we move to the pink line because of the price of good X going down. Now this fall in the price of good X is showing us both income and substitution effect. So what we do now is that we say that let's isolate the income and substitution effect. Only if only a good X were becoming relatively cheaper than good Y, I will make another line, a temporary line as we call it, which will be this green line, which will be parallel to my ultimate budget line. So make a line parallel to your ultimate budget line. Because this year's price is going up, I'm going to return, because this pink line has both income and substitution happening, I'm going to return some of the income to make this green line. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw an indifference curve that is tangent to both these graphs. So that's the first step, and the reason why we do so is because we are showing, let me draw a better job. But the reason why we're doing so is because we're showing is that simply that one good has become relatively more expensive than the other good. So if you were buying, for example, Q naught of good X, when the price of the good X goes up, we will move to from Q1 to Q naught to Q1. So you move from A to B. Then we will put our real income into play, and then when you put real income into play, then you move to point C, which is showing us that your substitution effect says buy less, income effect is also saying buy less, and ultimately we are buying less. So substitution effect says when the price goes down, you buy your quantity, when the price goes up, you are buying less of the good because the good is becoming relatively cheaper. And income effect also says this, that when the price of the good goes up, you're buying less. Okay, the key here is this: I made a very flat indifference curve to show both substitution and income effect easily. If you make a very steep indifference curve, that can be very difficult to show. So substitution effect and income effect, they move in the same direction, and they both tell us to buy less of that good. In the case of inferior good, so this is my normal good. In the case of inferior good, something like this will happen. So again, step number one is to make our x's good y and good x. Then we make a pretty flat kind of initial budget line, and then show that the price has gone down. So let's say initially, let's stick with the same colors, my indifference curve is this. Let me make a bit more flatter. Let's say initially my indifference curve is this, then the price is going sort of down, so my indifference curve become, for example, this, and then I'm going to show my real income has not changed, so the line will be parallel real income. So that's what it is like. So I'm going to make sure my budget line is parallel to my ultimate budget line, which is this pink line. Then we'll show our income effect, substitution effect will say buy less of the good. So I'm going to show something like this. These are the 2 points that I choose, and so if you were at point A, you are buying Q naught, you will start to buy, let's say, Q1. Substitution effect says buy less of the good. We're at point B now, but income effect will say, so this is indifference curve I naught, income effect will say that your real income is also going down. So ultimately the indifference curve that I'm going to make will be in between A and B, and I'm going to tell you why in 1 minute. So ultimately this is going to be like my Q2. So the key here is that when you make a indifference curve for an inferior good, it has to be in between the two points Q naught and Q1. When you make a case for normal good, it has to be further away from C. So in substitution effect said buy less, income effect then said buy more, because the good is inferior and your real income is going down. But because substitution effect was greater than income effect, ultimately we're going from Q naught to Q2. So here I'm going to show that substitution effect is still greater than income effect. That's why we're still buying more of that good. Now, to quickly discuss the conclusion here now, because we're done with the question. So discuss using indifference curve analysis how the impact of an increase in indirect taxation depends on whether, well, we'll say this, that, well, it depends on, of course, for normal versus inferior goods, both of these goods will have a downward sloping demand curve, because ultimately the consumer is going to buy less of that good. But for normal good, the impact would be much more. The good will be more probably elastic, because the income and substitution effect both will say buy less of the good. But for inferior goods, the good will be relatively less elastic, because substitution effects is buy less of the good, income effects is buy more. Ultimately, you are buying less, but as compared to normal goods, your quantity won't change that much, because the direction of the change is for income effect is in the opposite direction. So that could be the conclusion for this question. Now, before I move on, I'm going to look at also Feb March 17. It says this, that explain what is meant by in economic theory by consumer equilibrium. Well, consumer equilibrium simply, this is kind of like similar to the first question. Consumer equilibrium is simply what we call the equi-marginal principle. And the consumer equilibrium basically means you talk about first the utility theory. So talk about the utility theory, talk about the equi-marginal principle, talk about the law of diminishing utility and equi-marginal principle. And then we talk about that the equi-marginal principle is met where MUX over price of X is equal to MUY over price of Y. Then we talk about the idea that what if the MUX over price of X was greater than MUY over price of Y? That is where consumer will buy more of X and less of Y till this becomes equal, and that is useful for us because it will help us to derive demand curve, which is downward sloping. So I'm going to talk about this part, because let's say if you're not talking about indifference curve here, then how do we bring in the analysis of consumer equilibrium here? What I'm going to add here is the idea that that what if the price of good X goes down. So once you've explained your idea about utility, your indifference, your utility, your equi-marginal principle, and your deriving equi-marginal principle, then we talk about the deriving of demand curve. So let's talk about the deriving of demand curve through the, let me write this, derivation of demand curve through utility. Right, I'm going to go back to also through saying this, deriving the same thing through indifference, but in a little while. So let's say MUX over price of X is equal to MUY over price of Y. And what if the price of good X goes down? If price of good X goes down to PX dash, then we can say this, that MUX over price of X dash will be greater than MUY over price of Y, because good X has become cheaper. So now it's PX dash. So this part of my left hand side has become greater than right hand side. What should we do? We should buy more of X and we should buy less of Y. When we buy more of X, the MUX over PX dash will start to sort of fall, because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, which says that MUX will start to fall while MU of Y will start to rise. So this side will start to fall, this side will start to rise. There will come a point where this side will start to fall to become equal to that side which is rising. MUX over price of X dash will be equal to MUY over price of Y. Now in the process, what we've done is this, that when the price of X went down from PX to PX dash, we have ended up buying more of good from Q1 to Q2. So quantity and price, and ultimately we have a demand curve that is like this. From A I went to B, and that is showing us price went down, quantity goes up. So there is what we call a downward sloping demand curve. That comes because of the equi-marginal principle. When the price went down, we bought more of the good because the marginal utility per dollar spent goes up. So let me write this, when the price went down, your marginal utility per dollar spent went up, and that's why you bought more of that good. Now, if I go back to this part, you can derive a demand curve here as well, because let's say you were buying Q naught when the price was P naught, but ultimately you bought Q1 when the price went up, which would mean you have what we call still a downward sloping demand curve. When the price goes down, you're buying more of that good. And I can do the same thing here in the other diagram, where when you were buying Q0 versus ultimately you bought Q1. So when the price was P0, you were buying this quantity. When the price went to P1, you were buying, let's say, this quantity B. So if I join the 2 points together, I got myself demand curve. You can see this D dash versus D. D dash is more inelastic than D, because the substitution effect and income effect are not in the same direction. So that's the answer that we're going to write about consumer equilibrium, which is basically show how consumer equilibrium depends on the Equi marginal principle, and show how the price goes down, we can make a demand curve and so on. Then we talk about that, discuss the conditions that would cause the demand for a good to increase and fall as a result of a fall in the price of a good, and use indifference curve analysis to support your answer. So in this question, the most important part that we need to understand this is that in this question we're talking about the demand for a good to increase and fall as a result of a fall in the price of a good. When the price of a good goes down, right, what happens to the quantity demanded? Well, we say it goes up for both normal and inferior goods. But now we talk about what we call our given goods as well, because so I would say the only thing that is different about this question is basically once you talk about given goods, you talk about how when the price goes down, the quantity can actually go down here as well, and that's what I need to explain. That's the third case of given goods, which is basically going to be written here. So they're asking us when the price goes down, what happens? Well, when the price goes down, the quantity goes up, and that will be the case for normal and inferior good, and you'll show through diagram how substitution and income effect are both in such a manner that you are ultimately buying more of that good. But for given goods, that's not the case. And let's talk about given goods, which is also a commonly tested kind of concept in our exams. So it's a good thing to discuss now. So what are given goods? Well, we say given goods are inferior goods where they are so cheap that ultimately the substitution effect says when the price of a good goes down, the substitution effect will say buy more of that good. When the price goes down, you say you buy more of that good. So substitution effect still say buy more of that good. But income effect says this: when the price goes down, because your real income is going up, you may end up buying less of that good, but you may end up buying so much less of this good that ultimately, because remember this, that it's an inferior good, so you will buy less of that good, but you buy so much less of this good that the income effect becomes much larger. So substitution effect says buy more, income effect says buy less. But if I tell you guys this, that the income effect is greater than substitution effect, ultimately when the price goes down, you will buy less of that good. And why is that when people are buying less of this good, significantly less of this good, is that because if you're really poor and let's say you are consuming a very low quality rice, which is a given good, then when the price goes down for rice as a category, you might decide to buy less of that really low quality rice but may move on to a better quality rice. So ultimately your price is going down, but you are not buying that same quality rice anymore, but you moved on to a very significantly better quality rice. How do we show that in terms of a diagram? So this is how the diagram will look like. Again, try to make a, this is the price is going, in this case price is going sort of down. So let's say if this was my, let's assume this is my this is my budget line before, and then now budget line will be this. So substitution effect is saying this, that buy less of that good, but before I do that, I'm going to make a line parallel to my new indifference curve. Remember, in this case the price is going down, so this is my ultimate budget line. That's why this line is parallel to the one that I draw. Now my first indifference curve should be tangent to my this line and this line, so I'm going to do that. In this case, I'm going to say this, that I'm going to choose a point such that, let's choose this color. So I'm initially buying at point A. Then I decide to buy B because the good is becoming cheaper. So this is my substitution effect, which says simply buy more of the good because the good is becoming cheaper. Remember, in substitution effect, the nature of the good doesn't play a role at all, be it normal, inferior, or Giffen good. You will always buy more of the good because the good is becoming cheaper. But because the good is inferior as well, and not only inferior, it's Giffen, income effect will say buy less, and your indifference curve will be somewhere here where you will buy less of the good. For example, I1, which is going to be telling us to buy, let's say, Q2, and ultimately my income effect will be significantly larger, but in opposite direction. So my demand curve ultimately will be upward sloping, because if you look at this diagram, and I said I make a demand curve below, if I make a demand curve below, you can agree with me that when the price is going down, initially we were buying, for example, Q0. When the price went down, you end up buying Q2. So you have a case where price is basically going down. So let's say price was P0 before, then it went to P1, and you ended up buying less of that good, which is basically which is basically against the theory of demand, and it explains the idea that for Giffen goods, you're actually, when the price goes down, you buy less of that good. So in the case of normal goods, we normally show income and substitution effect reinforcing each other. In the case of inferior good, substitution effect and income effect move in opposite direction, but substitution effect is still larger than income effect. That's why the combination that you will choose will be between A and B, right? While in the case of inferior goods, income effect will be beyond point A, because you're showing an upper sloping demand curve. So these are the questions that I wanted to discuss for this chapter. There are many other questions, of course, but all of them use this kind of a theory, which is basically deriving demand curve using income and substitution effect for normal, inferior, and Giffen goods, and so on and so forth. So I want you guys to practice this, and I want you guys to remember to write about all of these concepts that we've discussed.